The following stories are believed by the authors to be true. I will tell them word for word, exactly as they were reported to me. This happened 9 years ago, in the early spring when I was 15 years old. I was at a friend's house in Corn Country, about an hour north of Indianapolis. Nowadays, I am very familiar with the paranormal, unexplained, having multiple shared experiences with friends. But at the time, I was a major skeptic. I had not even heard of skinwalkers. I didn't fully process what we saw until years later. I came over to my friend's house to hang out like any other time. I brought my pellet gun. He had one as well, so we could shoot some moles on his farm property. After a while, his brother joined us and we eventually got bored of looking for moles. There was a patch of woods about the size of 2 football fields, a little over a mile away, completely surrounded by empty cornfields with no access points from any nearby road. The 3 of us decided to walk out there, because why not? We were bored kids looking for fun. We put on some boots and headed out with our pellet guns. The walk wasn't super far, but it took us a while to reach the woods, because all the spring rain from earlier in the week made the empty field a big mud pit. So muddy your foot disappears with each step. Then, right as we walked through the brush surrounding the edge of the woods, we saw it. The best way I can describe this thing was a raccoon that was built like a Great Dane. We had seen coyotes and wolves before, and this was not that. It 100% looked like the biggest raccoon we had ever seen. We could tell we caught it off guard because it was just standing there, on all fours, grooming itself, and then it immediately locked eyes with us when one of us pointed at it and said, "Look at that thing!" There was a couple of seconds where we just looked at it, as it looked back at us, before it quickly turned around and scaled a 60-foot tree. We lost sight of it in the canopy. Then we looked at each other and were like, "What the heck was that?" And we talked about how the way it climbed the tree was what freaked us out the most. It only took a few strides up the tree, using its 2 front paws to grab a spot on the tree, to lift and launch itself up the tree. The arms were freakishly long and lanky looking when it climbed. It honestly looked somewhat human the way it articulated its arms as it climbed, like its elbows jutted out to the sides as it pulled itself up. We talked about how freaky that was some more, and decided to keep looking around, because even though we were spooked, it was intriguing and we wanted to see if there was any other freaky stuff around. There definitely was. The woods there were littered with easily over 100 animal carcasses and bone piles. Most of them were cows, raccoons, and opossums. There was one spot, maybe 25 by 25 feet, that had at least a dozen cow carcasses, ranging from just the bone left to one that looked less than a week old. They were definitely being eaten by something with huge chunks of flesh being missing. I know cows get loose all the time, but damn if this didn't look like a feeding spot. My theory is this thing was stealing cows from local farms for food. There are a couple within 5 miles. We also found a man-made small pond near the middle of the woods. Couldn't have been more than 6 feet wide. There was a shovel and plastic bucket sitting next to it. Once we found that, we were pretty freaked out again and decided we better head back because we had less than 2 hours of daylight left, and there was a lot of thick, deep mud to slowly walk through to get back. That's pretty much it. At the time, it freaked me out a bit, but looking back now, knowing what skinwalkers are, I'm just happy we came back completely unscathed. Unfortunately, I don't hang out with those guys anymore, and I tried to go back with some different friends somewhat recently, only to see that the woods had been cleared out and there was nothing there. I thought I was tripping out, but I looked on Google Earth and I could see in its place was dirt and log piles. Probably an omen to not chase this thing. I'll take it at face value. Do you guys think this was a skinwalker? Or just an apex raccoon? This is a story that was told to me by one of my firearms instructors named Chris. In northern Idaho, deep in the Rocky Mountains, there is a cabin that runs a cattle ranch. Chris's brother knows the owner, and invited Chris to spend the weekend up there for some hunting and hiking. The brothers gathered their supplies and a few of their best pals and took off to the mountains. As they were driving up the winding Idaho roads, his brother issued a cryptic warning. Sometimes the cattle escape into the woods and need to be tracked down. The owner of the ranch has seen some strange creatures in the forest. I'm not messing around. Everyone laughed and didn't take the warning seriously. Within the hour, they arrived at the cabin. On the second day in the mountains, Chris decided to go on an afternoon hunt with one of his friends. They drove down a back road into the forest until the road ended a few miles from the cabin. They got out and walked to the nearby creek, then split off with one person going upstream and one person going downstream. After walking for a ways, Chris came to a silty deposit where he noticed a foul odor and a broken pine tree that was green and healthy. The trunk was snapped in the direction of the water. There were 4 finger indentations in the tree bark, like it had been squeezed and pulled down by a massive hand. Sap bubbled from the compressed bark. On the ground, he discovered numerous huge footprints with 5 toes stamped into the silt. He followed them and counted 73 beautiful tracks that led to another snapped green pine tree. This tree also had big finger marks on it and was facing the direction of the water. Tracks danced all around this tree. The smell was now overwhelming. Chris became so spooked that he immediately ran back to the truck. His friend had shot a deer, and they quickly drove back to the cabin with it. At the cabin, Chris explained the situation to everyone. That night, 6 men from the cabin armed themselves, each with a rifle and a pistol, and returned by the truck to the end of the dirt road. They parked the truck facing the creek and then walked on foot to the edge of the water. It was a moonless, starry night, but the horrible smell still lingered. The band of hunters waited, and at one point howled into the night, calling for the creature. Chris thought he could hear something moving in the forest, but the creek was too loud to be sure. He decided to walk alone upstream into the woods to get a clearer sound. He could hear that there was definitely something big making its way through the pines. He ran back to the hunters and warned them that something was approaching. Moments later, from both up and downstream, they began to hear branches snapping and footsteps thudding. The sounds came from both directions, closing in on the group. The footsteps grew louder and louder, until the booming crunch of a log under the surface of the mud spooked them so much that they all ran back to the truck. In less than 2 minutes, they made it back to the vehicle. The moment they fired up the truck and turned on the headlights, they could see 2 massive bipedal hairy creatures moving up the creek in the location that they had just retreated from. The creatures' eyes shined from the truck's headlights. All of the men had clear shots, but all took flight back to the cabin in terror. The stench greeted them upon their return. They feared that with the slain deer outside, the creatures would be drawn to the property. They all slept curled up with their guns that night, but no more signs of the creature would be found. I told you, little brother, I was not f***ing around. He figures he ran into a family of them. There was a wild look in his eyes as he turned to me and said, I know they exist. So what are your thoughts? Are these encounters real? Let us know in the comments below.